What if I told you that water might have the ability to remember things, or that the US government spent decades hiding a horrific medical experiment? What if the military secretly tried to turn a ship invisible and something went horribly wrong? These are just a few of the disturbing scientific discoveries and cover-ups that have been swept under the rug. Dark scientific discoveries that were so disturbing they were erased. In 1988, French immunologist Jacques Benveniste shocked the world with a discovery that was so strange it sent ripples through the scientific community. Benveniste published a paper in the prestigious journal Nature claiming that water had the ability to remember substances that were once dissolved in it, even after those substances were removed. His work seemed to be presenting scientific backing for homeopathy, a practice that had been mostly dismissed as pseudoscience. At first, his findings were celebrated by some. The fact that water could somehow retain a sort of memory of previous molecules was a pretty cool idea, but as other scientists looked into it and attempted to replicate it, the results just weren't really there. The scientific community quickly turned against him, and Nature even distanced itself from the publication. In the years that followed, Benveniste's career spiraled, and the paper was ultimately discredited. But because this is Most Amazing Top 10, we can't shy away from the conspiratorial, and yes, there are people who still stand by his research, theorizing that Benveniste's work wasn't just discredited because it was drivel, but that there was this deliberate campaign to suppress his findings. If his research had been validated, it could have rendered much of modern chemistry obsolete. So according to some, his work may have been too disruptive to be allowed to stand. The Tuskegee syphilis study is one of the most horrifying chapters in American medical history. So horrifying, it was kept hidden from the public eye for decades. From 1932 to 1972, the United States Public Health Service conducted an experiment on African American men who had syphilis. They were told they were receiving treatment, but in reality, they weren't being given any proper care. The goal was to study the natural progression of the disease. These men, poor and mostly uneducated, were denied the cure for syphilis, which had actually been discovered pretty early on in the experiment, mind you. The study was kept secret for 40 years, wasn't finally exposed until 1972 thanks to a whistleblower. The Philadelphia experiment is one of those conspiracy theories that just won't die. Even decades after it supposedly happened, people are still fascinated by it. And there's a good reason for that. It's pretty nuts. It would actually make for a great movie, and I think it actually has. In 1943, the US Navy allegedly ran a secret experiment in Philadelphia to make the USS Eldridge, a naval ship, invisible to radar. But things went way off track, to say the least. According to some versions of the story, the crew didn't just become undetectable, they were reportedly fused with the ship, trapped in these nightmarish, impossible conditions. The Navy has always denied any involvement in this experiment, and most people just shrugged it off as a hoax, a mix of rumors and over-the-top claims. But what keeps this story alive is how deeply rooted it is in the world of conspiracy theories. For years, there's been stories about secret government projects from the post-World War II era dealing with everything from mind control to time travel. And some of these government projects were revealed to have been real. So was there any truth to the Philadelphia experiment? After World War II, the United States was desperate to secure scientific knowledge, particularly in the fields of rocketry and aerospace engineering. The United States government launched Operation Paperclip, a covert operation that brought over 1,600 German scientists, many of whom had been members of the Third Reich, to work for the American military. This included men like Wernher von Braun, who'd become instrumental in the development of the US space program. So while the US was racing against the Soviet Union to make it up into space, they were essentially rehabilitating some of the worst people to ever live. Many of these men have been directly involved in war crimes and highly unethical experiments, to put it very lightly. Of course, this operation was kept classified for years. It wasn't until decades later that the public fully understood the scope of what had been done. And here's a chilling idea. Some wonder if in the midst of the Cold War, these German scientists could have been part of even darker experiments, possibly even continuing the work they'd done in World War II under a new guise. But regardless, the American authorities were willing to overlook war crimes just to beat the Soviets into space. Back in the 70s and 80s, some really strange things were said to have gone down at Montauk Air Force Station in New York. The Montauk Project, as it's known, is one of those conspiracy theories that has taken on a life of its own. The story goes that the US government was running wild experiments in psychological warfare, mind control, and even crazier, time travel. Some accounts claim that the project involved this secret machine able to manipulate human consciousness, allowing the government to carry out experiments on innocent people without them even knowing. There are even stories about time travel experiments where subjects were supposedly sent to alternate realities or dropped into moments in history they had no business being in. Of course, the government denies any involvement, but the stories just keep coming. Tales of botched experiments and people being twisted in ways they couldn't possibly comprehend. Now, time travel, I don't know about that, but the government running a secret program on mind control and psychological warfare, that's really not all that far-fetched, considering you have projects like MK Ultra, all centered around psychological torment and mind control. MK Ultra would have sounded like a total conspiracy until it turned out it actually happened. The Roswell Incident. Back in 1947, something mysterious crashed near Roswell, New Mexico. At first, the US military called it a flying disc, but then they quickly walked that back, saying it was just a weather balloon. Well, that sudden flip-flop was enough to kick off years of speculation, with many believing the government was hiding proof of extraterrestrial life. Witnesses claimed to have seen weird debris from the crash site, and rumors spread that alien bodies had been recovered. Despite the official denials, the shifting stories from the military and the secrecy surrounding the whole event only made people more suspicious. Was it really a matter of national security, or was there something far more extraordinary being kept under wraps? You probably already know that Nikola Tesla was way ahead of his time. The guy practically set the foundation for everything from wireless communication to energy transmission, and he basically created the blueprint for much of the tech we rely on today. But some of his more out there ideas, like transmitting free energy, never really got off the ground. Now, there's a theory that his research was intentionally buried by the big players in the energy world. I mean, is it all that much of a stretch to imagine that the oil and electrical industries saw Tesla's work as a threat to their monopoly on global energy? In his later years, Tesla was pretty much broke and faded into obscurity, even though he was once hailed as this genius. Some people believe that parts of his work were deliberately erased, with its wildest, most groundbreaking ideas quietly shoved away. The thought that Tesla might have had the key to a cleaner, more sustainable energy future is pretty mind-blowing. Imagine if his research had been fully explored. Would we have skipped the energy crisis we're in now? Or was there just too much money and power at stake to let that happen? In the late 70s, Canadian psychologist Bruce K. Alexander conducted an experiment that would forever change the narrative around substance addiction. He created a kind of utopia for rats, this large, open enclosure that had food, toys, and other rats to socialize with. And this environment was drastically different from the typical small, isolated cages that are commonly used in addiction experiments. Interestingly, when given access to water laced with morphine, the rats in these better conditions didn't overconsume like the rats kept in isolated cages. It seemed to suggest that addiction wasn't just about chemical dependency, but could also be explained by social and environmental factors. The thing is, the findings of the rat park experiment never gained widespread acceptance in the scientific community. Critics argued that the study's design wasn't rigorous enough and dismissed it as flawed. Some believe the results were too controversial to be embraced by mainstream science. They directly challenged the textbook view on addiction. So even though it had the potential to completely flip how people understood addiction at the time, the experiment kind of got pushed aside in the scientific world, with more traditional theories taking the spotlight instead. In 2003, Dr. David Kelly, a British weapons expert, was found dead after being identified as the source of a BBC report that exposed the UK government's exaggerated claims about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. From the start, his death raised a lot of questions, mainly how this guy actually died. The official story was that he'd taken his own life, but the timing of this obviously just seemed a little too convenient. Did he really take his own life, or was there something more to it? Kelly had been very vocal about the misrepresentation of intelligence regarding Iraq, and his sudden death and some of the odd details surrounding it made a lot of people wonder if he'd been silenced. In the late 1920s, Emil Rupp, a relatively obscure German, I don't know why I did that so authentically, Emil Rupp, a relatively obscure German physicist, became the center of a scientific controversy that would eventually be erased from history. He was conducting experiments on Canal rays, electrically charged particles, at a time when wave-particle duality was just starting to be talked about in the scientific community. Rupp believed that his findings supported Einstein's theories about how, essentially, particles like electrons could behave as both waves and particles depending on the circumstances. Rupp's results were groundbreaking at the time, but in 1935 it all came crashing down. Rupp retracted his findings and admitted that his results were fabricated. But why? Was there more to the story? Well, see, some think his confession was less about scientific error and more about a desire to cover up something more insidious. Was there something going on here? Something too disruptive for the scientific world to accept? Well, whatever the case, Rupp's Canal ray experiments were mostly buried, and to this day, they're still largely forgotten. All that said, I've been your host, James, and I'll catch you, yes, you specifically, in the next video.